a king in a burning capital, hiding in the marshes from an enemy he cannot defeat. His city in ashes for the second time in 2 years. This was not Oyo, this was Dahomey, a rising West African kingdom, brought to its knees not once but 4 times, by a power it could not outrun. By the early 18th century, Oyo's cavalry was no longer just a means of survival. It had become the most feared force on the West African savanna, and it was about to reach further than anyone believed possible. By the early 1700s, the transformation that began generations earlier was complete. Oyo's cavalry was no longer a defensive tool built to survive Nupe and Borgu. It was an instrument of conquest, capable of striking targets hundreds of kilometers from the capital and returning before a rival kingdom could even organize a response. The kingdom that had once been humiliated into exile now sat at the center of a growing network of tributary states, stretching across the savanna and down toward the forest belt. Towns that had once weighed the cost of resisting Oyo's horsemen had long since made their peace, paying tribute in exchange for being left alone. But the greatest test of that power, and the campaign that would define Oyo's golden age, lay to the west on the Atlantic coast. In the early 18th century, a new power was rising along the slave coast. Under King Agaja, the kingdom of Dahomey expanded with startling speed, conquering the coastal kingdom of Alaafin in 1724 and the kingdom of Wida in 1727. In just 3 years, Agaja had more than doubled Dahomey's territory and seized control of the lucrative European trade routes running through the coast, where ships from Portugal, France, and England anchored to trade for goods, and, increasingly, for captives. There was one problem. Both Alaafin and Wida had been tributaries of Oyo since the 1680s. By conquering them, Agaja hadn't just expanded his kingdom. He had reached directly into Oyo's sphere of tribute and taken it for himself. Agaja was, technically, still a subject of the Alaafin. He had simply decided to act as if he wasn't. Agaja tried to smooth this over the way any vassal might, by sending gifts to the Alaafin. But the tribute he offered was smaller than what Oyo expected from territory of that value. Oyo's response was immediate and unambiguous. On April 14, 1726, the Oyo army marched on Dahomey. They took Agaja's capital, Abomey, and burned it to the ground. Agaja and his soldiers didn't stand and fight. They fled into the marshes and hid until the Oyo cavalry, having made its point, turned around and rode home. This was the pattern Oyo's cavalry had perfected. Strike hard, strike fast, and withdraw before the enemy could regroup. It was the same tactic that had built the empire's tributary network in the first place, now turned against a kingdom with real military ambitions of its own. For a forest kingdom without cavalry, there was no answer to it. Dahomey's soldiers could dig in behind walls, but Oyo's horsemen simply rode around them, burned what they needed to burn, and left before a defense could be organized. Agaja rebuilt Abomey. He conquered Wida the following year and sent Oyo a far richer tribute, hoping it would be enough. It wasn't. The terms still weren't acceptable, and on March 22, 1728, Oyo's cavalry rode into Dahomey a second time. Agaja adapted his strategy, burying his treasure, burning his own food supplies so the invaders would find nothing to sustain themselves on, and retreating rather than meeting Oyo's horsemen in open battle. It was a scorched-earth defense, born of desperation. It bought him time, but not victory. Oyo returned again in 1729, and Agaja, in a desperate bid to reinforce his army, is believed to have deployed women fighters disguised as soldiers to bolster his ranks, the earliest known route of what would later become the legendary Dahomey Amazons. None of it was enough. 4 invasions in 4 years. Every time, Oyo's cavalry came. Every time, Dahomey could burn its own fields, hide its own treasure, bury its own people in the marshes, and still, it could not stop them. In 1730, it ended. Agaja formally submitted to Oyo, accepting tributary status and agreeing to pay an annual tribute. 40 men and women, alongside guns, cowries, and coral, sent to the Alaafin's court every year. According to oral tradition, The terms cut so deep that Agaja was forced to send one of his own sons to live at the Oyo court as part of the arrangement, a hostage in the language of the era, though history remembers him as favored by his father precisely because his mother had been willing to give him up. A kingdom that had just conquered two rival states and seized control of a major stretch of the Atlantic coast, a kingdom powerful enough to reshape an entire region in 3 years, had been broken by Oyo's cavalry in 4 campaigns. Dahomey would remain a tributary of Oyo for nearly a century. The conquest of Dahomey wasn't a one-time show of force. It was proof of concept. With the coast now feeding tribute northward and trade routes running securely between the Atlantic and the Savannah, Oyo became the dominant power broker of the region, controlling the flow of goods and, increasingly, the flow of enslaved people moving toward European traders on the coast. The wealth this generated was staggering by regional standards. Cowrie shells, imported by the hundreds of thousands, became the empire's currency of choice, counted out by the sackful in Oyoile's markets. Cloth, guns, coral, and livestock moved in every direction along roads that radiated outward from the capital like spokes from a wheel. Oyoile itself grew into one of the largest cities in West Africa, a walled metropolis estimated to have housed around 100,000 people at its height. Its markets, chief among them the great Akasan market, filled with goods drawn from a trade network stretching from the Sahara to the Atlantic. More horses were bought. More riders were trained. The empire that had once feared for its survival was now an empire other kingdoms feared to provoke. The Alaafin sat at the center of Oyo's power, but he did not rule alone, and he did not rule unchecked. Alongside him stood the Oyo Messi, a council of senior chiefs whose authority was real, not ceremonial. They advised the king. They could challenge his decisions. And in the gravest circumstances, they held the power to reject an Alaafin they no longer supported. At the head of that council stood the Bashorun, the most powerful chief in the empire, and the figure responsible for representing the Oyo Messi's authority against the throne itself. This was not a flaw in Oyo's system. It was, by design, a system of balance. A monarchy restrained by its own aristocracy, built to prevent any single Alaafin from ruling as an unchecked tyrant. For decades, during the empire's rise, this balance worked. The Alaafin who launched the campaigns that broke Dahomey Ojigi ruled with the support of powerful chiefs behind him, chiefs who benefited directly from the tribute, captives, and trade wealth that his 4 invasions brought flowing into the capital. By the mid-18th century, Oyo stood at the height of its power. Its cavalry could reach the Atlantic coast. Its tribute network stretched across much of what is now southwestern Nigeria and into present-day Benin. Dahomey, once a rising conqueror in its own right, now answered to the Alaafin's court every year, in gold, in goods, and in people. The kingdom that had once fled its own capital in disgrace now sat as the dominant power of an entire region, its name spoken with caution as far away as the coast, where European traders had learned that no agreement in the region held real weight without Oyo's approval behind it. But an empire built on the balance between a king and his chiefs carries within it the seeds of its own instability. Every gain in the Alaafin's power was matched by a gain in the power of the men who advised him. And the same council that had helped Oyo rise, the Oyo Messi, led by its Bashorun, was about to produce one of the most ruthless power struggles in Yoruba history. The empire was at its peak, but the Golden Throne was more fragile than anyone in Oyoile could yet see. That struggle, a kingmaker who would force 4 kings to their deaths, is where this story turns next.